What if I told you that in 1800s America, you could be locked away for reading too much, for arguing with your spouse, or simply for being inconvenient? No trial, no diagnosis, just one signature, and you were gone. They didn't scream. That's the part no one talks about. You would expect chaos, crying, panic, but when the trains began to move, most of the children just sat there, quiet, confused, clutching whatever little they had left, a worn-out coat, a small tin box, a name they were about to lose. Between 1854 and 1929, more than 200,000 children were taken from the crowded cities of the American East, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and placed onto trains headed west. They called it a humanitarian effort, a solution to poverty, a chance for a better life. But step back for a second and look at it differently. Thousands of children, loaded onto trains, sent away from everything they knew, not with their families, not with people they trusted, with strangers. The process was disturbingly simple. Children were lined up at stations or placed on display in small town halls. Local families would gather, walk past them, examine them like livestock at an auction. Strong enough, too small, that one looks obedient. And just like that, a decision was made. A child would be chosen, or left behind. Some were lucky. They found families who treated them with kindness, gave them education, gave them a future they never would have had in the slums. But many weren't. Many became unpaid labor, farm hands, house servants. And the younger they were, the easier it was. Because younger children don't question as much. They adapt. They forget. That was the key. Forgetting. Names were changed. Birth records disappeared. Siblings were separated, sometimes at the same station, sometimes across entire states. A brother sent to Kansas, a sister to Missouri, never to see each other again. No letters, no tracking, no system to reconnect them. It was as if they had never been related at all. Imagine being 5 years old, too young to understand what's happening, old enough to feel that something is very, very wrong. You remember your mother's face, but only vaguely. You remember a street, a smell, a voice calling your name. But each year, it fades, until one day, it's gone. And the new name, the one given to you by strangers, is the only one you respond to. Decades later, their descendants would try to trace their lineage. They would search records, dig through archives, follow fragmented clues, and find nothing. No birth certificate, no original surname, no proof of where their bloodline began. Because officially, it didn't exist anymore. History tells this story as something noble, a rescue, a necessary intervention during a time when cities were overwhelmed with poverty and abandoned children. And maybe part of that is true. But there's something else, something that doesn't quite sit right. Because when you look closely, this wasn't just relocation. It was erasure, identity erased, family erased, origin erased, systematically, at scale. And here's where the story starts to shift. Because children can forget. Children can be reshaped, given new lives, new stories, new identities. But adults? Adults, remember. Adults ask questions. Adults resist. They carry stories that don't disappear so easily. Stories about where they came from, about what they saw, about what existed before. So, think about it. If you wanted to rewrite the past, if you needed to make sure an entire generation grew up with no memory of what came before, moving the children would only solve half the problem, because somewhere there were still people who knew the truth. Parents, grandparents, neighbors, witnesses. And witnesses are dangerous, not because they're loud, but because they remember. So the question isn't just, why were the children sent away? The real question is, what happened to the ones who were old enough to remember everything and refuse to forget? Because history gives us a very clear answer about the children. But when it comes to the adults, it goes quiet, too quiet. And that silence, that's where the real story begins. The children were sent away, scattered across farms, towns, and unfamiliar homes, given new names, new lives, new histories. And over time, they forgot. But not everyone could. Because somewhere behind those disappearing names and rewritten identities, there were still people who remembered exactly how things used to be. Adults. And adults are harder to erase. That's when the pattern begins to shift. Because while children were being relocated across the country, something else was happening at the exact same time. Quietly, rapidly, almost aggressively. Between 1845 and 1910, the United States constructed nearly 300 psychiatric hospitals. Not small facilities, not temporary shelters, massive stone institutions, built across nearly every state. At first glance, it sounds like progress. History calls it a movement of compassion, a response to the horrific conditions people with mental illness faced before. And that part is true. Before this era, the mentally ill were often chained in basements, locked in poorhouses, abandoned without care. So the idea of dedicated hospitals, places of healing, light, and structure seemed revolutionary, almost noble. But then you look closer, and the timeline starts to feel off, because these buildings didn't appear gradually, they appeared all at once. Within a few decades, the landscape of America changed. Enormous stone complexes rose out of open land, far from cities, far from public view, each one designed to hold hundreds, sometimes thousands, of patients. And they weren't built like hospitals, they were built like palaces, long wings stretching outward like arms, central towers rising above the countryside, ornate stonework, perfect symmetry. This was known as the Kirkbride Plan, a design meant to heal the mind through environment. Sunlight in every room, fresh air flowing through long corridors, nature surrounding every structure. It was, on paper, the ideal place for recovery. But something doesn't add up. Because for a young nation, barely a century old at the time, these buildings were incredibly advanced. They had their own water systems, their own farms, their own rail access, complex heating and ventilation, entire self-contained worlds hidden just beyond the edge of society. And the question becomes unavoidable. Why the urgency? Why did America suddenly need 300 massive institutions in such a short period of time? Why build them so large, so isolated, so permanent? The official answer is simple. There were more people in need of care, but that explanation starts to crack when you examine who was actually being admitted. Inside the admission records of these institutions, you don't find diagnoses as we understand them today. You find reasons. Strange ones, unsettling ones. People were committed for excessive reading, religious excitement, political agitation, disappointment in love, domestic trouble, laziness, overthinking. These aren't symptoms of mental illness. They're behaviors, human behaviors, ordinary, imperfect, inconvenient behaviors. And that word starts to matter, inconvenient. Because what do all these reasons have in common? They describe people who are difficult to manage, difficult to control, difficult to silence. And once that pattern clicks, it's impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, these institutions don't just look like hospitals. They look like something else entirely. Think about the logistics. If someone is sent to one of these facilities, they're taken away from their home. Their belongings are removed. Their name is recorded, but records can be changed, lost, misplaced. They're placed among others, some truly ill, others not. And from that moment forward, their credibility is gone. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter what they remember, because they are now officially labeled insane. And once that label is attached, there is no appeal, no easy way out, no one willing to listen. The system doesn't need to prove you're crazy. It only needs to declare it. And here's what makes it even more unsettling. In many cases, the institutions offered financial incentives to anyone who brought in a patient, which means there was motivation to find people, to label them, to send them away. Now step back again. Look at both systems side by side. On one hand, children being relocated, renamed, and absorbed into new lives. On the other, adults being removed, labeled unstable, and locked behind stone walls. Two completely different processes, but leading to the same outcome. The children lose their past, the adults lose their voice. And what's left? A society where no one can reliably speak about what came before, because the ones who might remember are no longer being heard, and the ones who could have learned the truth never knew it existed. At this point, it's still possible to believe this is all coincidence, that these hospitals were built out of genuine concern, that the records simply reflect a primitive understanding of mental health, that the overlap in timing means nothing, but the pattern is there, and once you see it, it doesn't go away, because now the question becomes sharper, more focused. more uncomfortable. If these institutions were meant to heal, why do so many of them feel designed to contain? Why are they so isolated, so massive, so permanent? And most importantly, who exactly were they built for? Because whatever answer you choose, it has to explain one thing. Why, at the exact moment children were being taught to forget, America was building a system perfectly designed to silence anyone who still remembered. It didn't take evidence. It didn't take a diagnosis. It didn't even take a doctor. In 19th century America, all it took was a signature. A husband could commit his wife to an asylum. No court hearing, no medical examination, no defense, just paperwork, one form, one decision. And by nightfall, she was gone. Imagine how easy that makes it. A disagreement, a conflict, a marriage that no longer works. Or maybe something smaller. She talks too much. She questions too often. She refuses to obey. That's all it takes. Because once the word insane is written next to your name, the system doesn't ask questions. It acts. And once you're inside, everything changes. Your identity shifts instantly. You're no longer a person. You're a patient. Your words don't carry weight anymore. Your memories don't matter. Your version of reality is no longer considered real. And the most terrifying part? The more you try to prove you're sane, the more they believe you're not. In 1887, a journalist decided to test this system. Her name was Nelly Bly. She didn't investigate from the outside. She went in. She pretended to be mentally ill, just enough to get admitted into the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island. And once the doors closed behind her, she saw something that would shock the entire country. The abuse was real. Ice-cold baths that left women shaking uncontrollably. Rotten food, barely edible. Nurses who punished patients for speaking out of turn. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was who she found inside. Women who were completely sane. Immigrants who couldn't speak English and couldn't explain themselves. Women who were simply exhausted from physical labor, labeled mentally deficient. Women who had been committed by angry husbands or relatives who wanted them gone. One woman begged for release. She spoke clearly, logically, calmly, and yet no one listened, because to the system, her words meant nothing. She had already been categorized. Nelly Bly later wrote something chilling. The more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier they thought I was. Think about that for a second. A system designed to identify insanity that cannot recognize sanity when it's standing right in front of it. Once you're inside, logic works against you. Reason becomes resistance. Clarity becomes denial. Confidence becomes delusion. And suddenly, there's no way out. Because how do you prove you're sane to a system that interprets sanity as illness? The answer is you don't. The asylum becomes a trap, easy to enter, impossible to escape. And this isn't just one story. This is one institution, one investigation, one small glimpse into a much larger system. Because remember, there weren't just one or two asylums. There were hundreds of places where a single accusation could erase a person completely. No trial record, no public trace, no credibility left. And once someone is labeled insane, anything they say about the world outside, about the past, about what they remember, is instantly dismissed. Now step back again. Look at the pattern. Children are being removed from their origins, taught new identities, raised without memory of where they came from. At the same time, adults are being locked away, their voices discredited, their memories isolated behind walls no one questions. And suddenly, the system becomes clearer. Because if someone came forward and said, "Things weren't always like this. The world used to be different. You're being told a version of history that isn't true," who would believe them? No one, because they're already labeled insane. Their testimony is invalid before it's even heard. And that's what makes this system so effective. It doesn't just remove people, it removes trust. It ensures that even if someone manages to speak, no one will listen. Now think about the scale. Hundreds of institutions, thousands of patients, decades of operation. How many of those people were truly sick? And how many were simply inconvenient? How many were misunderstood? How many were silenced? How many were telling the truth, and no one could hear it? Because once you understand how easy it was to disappear someone, the question changes. It's no longer, why were people sent to asylums? It becomes, who benefited from them being there? And more importantly, What stories, what memories, what truths were buried along with them? Because by now, one thing is certain. This system wasn't just flawed, it was powerful, precise, and incredibly efficient at doing one thing, making people vanish, without ever leaving a trace. By the time you were inside, it was already too late. The doors didn't just close behind you, they sealed something else. Your certainty, your identity, your grip on reality. Because inside these walls, the goal wasn't just to contain you, it was to change you. They called it treatment, therapy, care, rehabilitation, words that sound gentle, almost hopeful. But what actually happened inside those rooms was something very different. It began with water. Hydrotherapy, they called it. You were strapped into a tub, your body submerged, only your head left above the surface. Hours would pass, sometimes days. Cold water poured over you without warning, shocking your system over and over again. Your body trembles, your mind starts to blur. Time loses meaning. Then came the wet sheet pack, your body wrapped tightly in freezing cloth, layer after layer, pinned down, unable to move, left there, shivering, until someone decided you'd had enough. Enough for what? No one ever explained. Then isolation. A small room, no sound, no interaction. Just you and your thoughts. At first, you hold on to them. You repeat your name. You replay memories. You remind yourself who you are. But time stretches. Hours turn into days. Days into something harder to measure. And slowly, those memories begin to slip. Not all at once. Just small things at first. A face you can't quite picture anymore. A voice that sounds unfamiliar. A detail that doesn't feel solid. And then come the restraints. Devices designed to calm the mind. Straps, belts, wooden enclosures. There was one called the Utica crib, a wooden cage. You were placed inside it, and the lid was closed above you. No standing, no walking, barely any movement at all. You were still alive, still conscious, but reduced to something less than human. And then, the spinning chair. You were strapped in. The chair begins to rotate. Faster, faster. Your vision blurs. Your stomach turns. Your sense of direction collapses. Up feels like down. Left feels like nowhere. And eventually, you stop trying to understand anything at all. Because that's the point. Not healing. Not clarity. Disorientation. The breakdown doesn't happen in one moment. It happens gradually. Systematically. You enter with certainty. I know who I am. I know what I've seen. I know what's real. And piece by piece, that certainty is stripped away. You begin to doubt yourself. Maybe they're right. Maybe something is wrong with me. Maybe my memories aren't accurate. Maybe I imagined it. And once that doubt takes hold, the system doesn't need to fight you anymore, because you start doing the work for them. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If you wanted to make sure someone could never testify, never be believed, never hold on to a clear version of events, what would you do? You wouldn't need to kill them. You wouldn't need to silence them permanently. You would just need to make them uncertain, unreliable, unconvincing. You would take a person who knows something and turn them into someone no one trusts. And that's exactly what this system does, perfectly, because when a person finally leaves, if they ever leave, they don't come out the same. Their memories are fragmented, their confidence is gone, their words don't carry weight. And even if they try to explain what happened, what they saw, what they remember, who would believe them? They were in an asylum. That's all it takes. Their story is dismissed before it begins. Now zoom out again. Look at the full picture. Children are removed from their past before they're old enough to question it. Adults are subjected to systems that break their ability to explain it. One group forgets naturally. The other is forced into confusion. Different methods. Sama result. No memory. No testimony. No contradiction. And that's when the realization hits. This isn't random. It's not just bad medicine, not just outdated practices. It's a system that intentionally or not is perfectly designed to do one thing: erase certainty. Because once people lose certainty, they lose everything. They lose their past, their identity, their ability to stand in front of the world and say, this is what I know is true. And without that, truth becomes fragile. Easy to reshape, easy to rewrite, easy to replace. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Children, relocated. Adults, neutralized. Memories, destabilized. And all of it happening in the exact same window of time. So the question is no longer hypothetical. It's direct. If this system wasn't designed to erase people, then why does it work so perfectly when it does? And if it wasn't meant to silence memory, then why is memory the very thing that disappears? Because somewhere inside those walls, under layers of stone, silence, and time, something didn't just break. Something was taken, and once it was gone, no one left could clearly explain what had been lost. By the end of it, there are no witnesses left. Not the kind you can trust. Not the kind anyone would listen to. Because the children grew up without a past, and the adults lost the ability to prove they ever had one. And that's how something disappears. Not in a single moment. Not with noise or destruction, but quietly. Systematically, you remove the memory, and then you remove the people who remember. And what's left? A clean version of history. Untouched, unquestioned, unchallenged. But numbers don't disappear as easily as people do. There were 300 asylums built across the United States, each designed to hold hundreds of patients, but many held far more, some reaching 2,000, even 2,600 people at their peak. Do the math. That's not a handful of cases. That's hundreds of thousands of individuals, passing through these institutions over just a few decades, hundreds of thousands of voices, silenced not by death, but by disbelief, because once someone is labeled insane, their testimony carries no weight. They could describe everything in perfect detail, speak clearly, logically, calmly, and still, no one would take them seriously. That's what makes this system so effective. It doesn't erase the story. It erases the credibility of the storyteller. And without credibility, truth has nowhere to stand. Now look at what remains. Many of these buildings still exist today, not functioning as hospitals anymore, not filled with patients, but standing, massive stone structures, slowly decaying at the edges of towns and cities. Their towers still rise. Their corridors still stretch endlessly. Their walls, thick enough to muffle screams, still hold their shape. But inside, there is nothing. Empty rooms, peeling paint, broken windows, places that once held thousands of people, now reduced to silence. Some have become tourist attractions, ghost tours, paranormal sites. People walk through them at night, searching for shadows, listening for whispers, hoping to feel something unexplainable. And maybe they do, but not because of ghosts. Because places like that don't forget, even when records are gone, even when names are erased, even when history moves on, the structure remains, a physical reminder that something happened there, something large, something organized, something we no longer fully understand. And that's where the final question begins to take shape, because by now, the pattern is clear. Children, removed and reshaped. Adults, isolated and discredited. Memories, weakened or erased. All within the same period, all within the same system. So ask yourself, what exactly was so dangerous? That it required both? What kind of past needs children to forget it, and adults to be silenced? Because if nothing unusual had existed, if history was exactly as it's been told, then none of this would be necessary. You wouldn't need to relocate hundreds of thousands of children. You wouldn't need to build 300 massive institutions. You wouldn't need a system that can make people disappear without ever killing them. And yet, all of it happened. Now here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. There is no final proof. No document that says, this is why it was done. No single piece of evidence that ties everything together cleanly. Only patterns, timing, scale, and silence. And sometimes, silence says more than anything else. Because when something is truly insignificant, it fades naturally. But when something is systematically erased, it leaves behind gaps, inconsistencies, questions that don't go away. And this is one of them. Why did an entire generation lose its past? Why were so many people labeled insane, for reasons that make no sense today? Why were these institutions built so fast, so large, so hidden? And most importantly, who were the people inside them, before the doors closed? Because they weren't just numbers. They weren't just patients. They were witnesses, people who had lived long enough to remember something different, something that didn't fit, something that, if spoken out loud, might have changed everything. But we'll never know what that was, because whatever they knew, whatever they saw, whatever they tried to say, it never made it out. The children forgot, the adults were dismissed, And the past went quiet, not gone, just quiet enough that no one could hear it anymore. But here's the part no one tells you. The story didn't end there. Because even when memories are erased, even when names are changed, even when entire lives are rewritten, something always remains. Not in records, not in official history, but in fragments. A feeling that something doesn't add up. A story passed down without proof. A face remembered without a name. Generations later, people started asking questions again. Families began searching, digging through forgotten archives, comparing records that didn't match, following threads that were never meant to be followed. And slowly, piece by piece, the silence began to crack. Lost siblings were reunited. Real identities were uncovered. Stories, once dismissed, started to make sense. Not everything came back. Not every name was recovered. But enough did. Enough to prove one thing. The truth can be buried, but it doesn't disappear. Because memory isn't just something we hold in our minds. It lives in patterns, in bloodlines, in the questions we refuse to stop asking. And maybe that's why you're here right now. Listening, wondering, questioning. Because no matter how carefully a story is rewritten, there will always be someone, somewhere, who feels that something is missing and decides to find it. So maybe this isn't the story of something that was erased. Maybe it's the story of something that is slowly being remembered. And this time, it won't be forgotten again.